Welcome to the 15th episode of the podcast. This is your proprietor, Tony Ortega, coming to you from an undisclosed location deep inside the interior of the Earth's crust, otherwise known as the underground bunker. The big news this week, of course, is that former Scientology spokesman and Leah Remini's co star, Mike Rinder, has released his really terrific book about his experience in the church, A Billion Years My Escape from Life in the Highest Ranks of Scientology. And in our review, we pointed out that we felt the book had a unique place in the literature of this crazy organization that we keep an eye on. In order to help us put that into some perspective, we thought we'd discuss the book with one of the OGs on the scene, the man whose monumental history of Scientology was our own introduction to the subject, none other than historian and underground bunker contributor, John Atack. Well, what an honor it is for us here today at the Underground Bunker to be speaking to our old friend John Atack.
Hey, Tony.
John, thank you for joining me.
Always a
Yeah,
pleasure.
when I got a hold of Mike's book and started reading it, the first thing I started thinking about was where this was going to fit in sort of the pantheon of books. And of course, I
Canon.
mean
Yeah.
the first book I read really of Scientology history was yours.
Oh, yeah.
And it educated me so much about where this thing had come from and where it had been.
Hmm.
And I was intensely curious as I was reading Mike's book to think, oh, what's John going to think of that? Is that is that new? Is that not new? I wasn't sure. So I thought we'd just spend some time today and talk it over because it seems like it's an important moment in Scientology history, which you and I are both interested in.
Hmm. Yeah, I think you're right. Mike Rinder is a very interesting and very courageous man. And for me, it's a peculiar situation because I only met Mike once while he was in Scientology, and that was in a room full of lawyers who had flown over from Los Angeles to try and intimidate me into accepting a silence contract and walking away. And so that's the only time we met. And the meeting didn't go very well because I asked everybody to tell me their Sea Org ranks, and they wouldn't, and I left the meeting. And I wasn't going to take a payoff anyway. But when we met many years later, and the interview is on my YouTube channel, John Atack Family and Friends, he admitted that although he thought I was a decent sort of bloke, he would have destroyed me if he possibly could. And that fanaticism is fascinating to me. How somebody can become so engrossed. I mean, Voltaire said, "People who believe absurdities will commit atrocities." And Mike not only tells us about Scientology and about Hubbard, and of course he had a very close relationship with Hubbard. He'd be alone with them on many occasions when he was a watch messenger. But he not only tells us about that, but he tells us about the struggle when you've come to believe something absolutely, and how on earth you try and extricate your head from that. Can I say also that I have a number of interviews with Mike on my channel, which
Sure.
cover some of the salient points of the book. And some people have criticized me for talking with him. I should disconnect from him probably. And because he hasn't apologized enough yet. And I think just the very act of standing up, and I am one of the people who was harassed by him. I think the very act of standing up and going public, knowing the tsunami of aggression that he would unleash, exonerates him of any guilt he should feel for the harm he did. So there's my opening.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up. That's a very interesting way to put it. I think that's an excellent thing to keep in mind. Is sure he was in charge of the OSA and in charge of some of these campaigns, but since coming out, he has really planted a target right on his chest
Mhm.
and has withstood an onslaught. Now, in some people's minds, that's not enough. I understand that's a personal thing for them, but it's interesting to hear from someone who was definitely, targeted
Mhm.
that you feel the acts that he's gone through to expose Scientology really make up for that?
Yes, it's a sufficient act of contrition. Let's put it that way. And I had 16 years of pretty much daily harassment. So, but anybody who's willing to put their head above the parapet and talk openly about what happened to them, I think that does exonerate them.
Wow. So, what are some of the things that I mean? I was so curious as I was going through, and there would be some detail that I hadn't seen before, and I would immediately wonder, now is that just because of my poor memory and I can't remember already reading it in John Atack's book or Russell Miller's book,
Mm.
or was this something genuinely new? Can you tell me what were some of the things that you found really interesting, some new sort of perspectives on this Scientology history that help fill things in for all of us?
Sure. I mean, because I've interviewed him, at some length, um, during those interviews, I became aware of material details that I didn't have. So, for example, um, he he was about 6 years old when his parents got involved in Scientology, somewhere around there. It was 1959 when they got in, and he grows up, you know, with this fervor, and arrives in Lisbon in 1973 to go onto Hubbard's cattle ferry, the Apollo, which was not kind of the cruise liner he'd imagined, um, and talked about um, the state of the ship, and for those of us who believed in Scientology, of course, anything that was next to Ron Hubbard would be an ideal scene. Those are the words he used. It would be a perfect place to be. So his description in the book, he's arrived there. He's meant to be trained as an executive. He's 18. He's meant to be trained to go back to Australia and run an Australian organisation. But he has his passport taken away. He has no money. He couldn't even afford the cab fare to the airport, let alone the flight back to Australia. And he's told that he's been traded. That's the word used by the Australian organisation, traded, human trafficking. And he's told you perform whatever duty you're assigned. So he's basically been given into slavery at this point. And his description, and I remember this when I interviewed him when he talked about it, although I've interviewed so many people who were on the ships, but the squalid detail doesn't necessarily get through. And so he says in the book, walking into the men's dorm was an onslaught to the senses. The overpowering odour of sweaty bodies and dirty clothes filled the pitch dark, airless room. There was no porthole, no view, or even a light. There was no air conditioning. My room at home seemed like a prince's palace, a vision from a past life I wished I could teleport back to. Guided by a flashlight, the berthing in charge suggested I hold on to the back of his shirt and follow him closely. As I looked around, I faintly made out a room about 30 feet wide and 60 feet long, with several rows of triple stacked bunks. With a ceiling height of 6.5 feet at the most, the space crammed in about 50 men. My bed, sandwiched in the middle of a triple bunk, was at the very end of the room. Because the Apollo operated on both day and night shifts, there were always people sleeping, and thus no lights. There were also no closets in the men's dorm, so people hung their dirty clothes on hooks next to their beds. Nor were there laundry facilities other than buckets to wash your clothes in salt water and then give a final rinse in precious fresh water. I felt like I had arrived in the black hole of Calcutta. The showers were no better. 30 seconds was all we could get, as there were only 3 or 4 showers available on the ship, and always a line of men standing waiting for their turn. Fresh water was extremely limited, and it was not hot, so I couldn't bear much longer than 30 seconds anyway. Um, so you find this awful, squalid place, and you sort of think, well, no, Hubbard was an expert on management. He will have treated people so well. He will have looked after them so well. And you find that they were actually getting 4 or 5 hours sleep a night. And, you know, it's the detail. I mean, I remember somebody who'd been for 10 years in this organization giving me the tip that if your socks were dirty, you could turn them inside out. And you sort of think they're just reduced to this terrible, abject state. And the other side of that is, which I think sings out of this book is the, but I'm saving the world. I've got to take on all of these terrible conditions because it's a necessity. And if I don't do this, I remember Nora Beth Crest at Toronto when we were at Toronto in 2015, saying that when she wanted a day off, she'd be lectured on, how many millions of people would suffer as a consequence of her having a day off. So that intensity, having that underlined, I think is very important.
I think he does a very good job of that. I said that in my review that
Mm,
um, he's he's conscious of the fact that the reader who's not a Scientologist is going to be constantly asking, "What kept you in? Why didn't you run away? Why would you put up with this?"
mm,
And so I think maybe as well as anybody in this book, he tries to help the reader understand the mindset
yeah.
and understand why where this dedication comes from and how hard it was to break away from that. I thought that was a very valuable thing in this book.
I think it's important. I mean, Lawrence Wright in Going Clear can't understand why it was when the FBI launched the largest raid in their history that people who were on the rehabilitation project force, the little internal gulag in Scientology, just stayed and waited. They didn't walk, they didn't escape. Um, a friend I used to work with said that it was like with her canaries, that when she opened the cage door, they stayed inside. And that's to do with psychological slavery, with promising people that they will become like gods if they follow your ridiculous hypnotic nonsense. I don't think I would ever described it as that, but that's what it is. Um, that you're promised everything you could ever want, and but you've just got to suffer now, and it is that sort of, you're on a crusade. You're going to give up every luxury, every amenity. Just, I mean, when I talked with Mike, we talked about food, and to me, the thought of eating slop on a daily basis for decades, I just can't imagine that. That you've become a tool for this dreadful human being, Ron Hubbard, to be used as he chooses at his disposal. Um, he talked with me about Bruce Welsh, who, his first job aboard the Apollo was guarding the cell door for Bruce Welsh. And I I did another interview with Karen de la Carriere, who was working with Hubbard at the time. So I got two perspectives on what happened to Bruce Welsh. Bruce, and I actually talked to a friend who was aboard the ship with him. Bruce Welsh was a very large man. He was a Canadian, um, and he was a devoted Scientologist who, uh, what actually happened, unbeknownst to Mike, is that he threatened to kill Hubbard. And that meant that he was psychotic, because who in their right mind would want to do that? And so he's locked in a cabin. And Mike's first job aboard the Apollo was to make sure that nobody tried to talk to him. And this led to Hubbard claiming that he had found a cure for psychosis, that all you had to do was stop all communication with a person and they would become sane. And there was no longer any need for psychiatry because of this. And this is like, it's one guy, Bruce Welsh, that's the whole of the research. Um, and Bruce Welsh, in fact, left the ship and left Scientology, so it didn't work that well. And Hubbard was, in fact, pushing notes under the door, but Welsh was apparently so worked up that he tore apart a metal bedstead and fed the pieces through the porthole. You know, so getting into that and realizing how intense this experience was, and how are you meant to keep your head when all around are losing theirs? That everybody is dedicated to this imaginary goal, this clearing the planet. And
Well, and I thought it was just another amazing example where Mike just somehow found himself at the most amazing points in Scientology history because that incident you're talking about became what was known as the introspection rundown. This is
right,
the regimen that Hubbard claimed he had discovered on how to treat a psychotic person.
mm,
And it was Mike Rinder who was there guarding this guy in the first instance of that. And then That was about what, 73 or something like that.
'73, yeah.
And then 22 years later, another person being subjected to the introspection rundown by the name of Lisa McPherson dies on them, and then it's Mike Rinder who's flown out to Clearwater to deal with the legal fallout. So that's another thing that's I think so really fascinating about this book is that Mike just repeatedly found himself in the right time in the right place at the right time to give us a window on where this organization has been. It's really quite remarkable, isn't it?
And he bridges because he was often with Hubbard. Um, he then bridges into the Miscavige era,
Right.
Miscavige's takeover, and he is there at key events. I mean, one of the things for years, once I'd heard, um, you have the deposition of Pat Broker, Pat and Nanny Broker, and I think Hubbard probably did appoint them to take Scientology over. Um, by this time, Hubbard was demented, and you know he was suffering from alcoholism and taking all sorts of medications, which of course were found at autopsy in his system, the brief autopsy that was done. But I think he probably did promote the brokers to take over. And there's this incident where people are sent to take the filing cabinets from Broker's office. And my immediate thought when I first heard about this, which had been in the late 80s, was Miscavige thought that the missing upper OT levels,
Right.
OT9 upwards, would be in these cabinets. And I mean, you're the man who disclosed to the world that there were two private detectives who, for 24 years, at a cost of I think it was $11 million, were tailing Broker because Miscavige has nothing. He doesn't have these purported 15 levels that exist above um, OT7. That actually connects into the Bruce Welch story too, because I think it's list 11, which is meant to have come from OT22, that the stuff with Bruce Welch was not only used for the introspection rundown, but also for this list 11. So it all sort of ties together. Um, we find, you know, he was there at crucial moments, and um, gives us information that that does tie things up, that helps us to understand better. That we went from Hubbard, who is a narcissistic, manic depressive psychopath, um, possibly with temporal lobe epilepsy. I think he probably did have that. We moved from him and his fairly petty sadism nonetheless, to Miscavige, who is a quite different order of creature, and a thug fundamentally. The amount of violence that is spoken about in the book is shocking even now. I mean, and I've been hearing about his violence since the Mission Holders Conference in 1982, but it brings it up that you can have somebody running this organization, and because nobody who's involved, if the police went to somebody who was on the rehabilitation project force when it was running and said, "Do you want to leave?" they'd say, "No, I'm here of my own free will." And with that complexity, that the true believer who will do anything for the good of the cause.
Right. And yeah, it's interesting to me that and Rinder I don't think engages in it too much in his book, but there is this disappointment from a lot of longtime Scientologists that are from that era who will try to convince you that well, I was talking to Jesse Prince just a couple weeks ago, and he was saying something similar that Hubbard was this megalomaniac and everything, but things were run a little bit more by committee under him. And once Miscavige took over, it was just this one man dictatorship. And how did that happen? And you see, a lot of old timers who have left and wonder what happened. They'll go over it and over it, and how did this one man push aside the brokers
mm,
and Vicky Asneran and all these other people.
yeah,
And Mike engages into that somewhat, but it just seems to me, John, and maybe you disagree with me, but it just seems to me that L. Ron Hubbard was this megalomaniac who ran this completely undemocratic top down organization. And once he died, as much as people thought there might be some committees and some sort of an election or something,
mm,
it was just the most ruthless person took over.
yeah,
And if it hadn't been David Miscavige, it would have, and that's why Pat Broker is not the leader of Scientology today. He was not ruthless. He did not want to push people out of the way to take over, and so David Miscavige did. And I don't know. I just feel like it's sort of this just fantasy, wishful thinking to think that there might be that somehow after Hubbard there would be some sort of reasonable more democratic based Scientology.
no, and as Mike points out, there was always a break on Hubbard, and that was Mary Sue Hubbard. Um, that although she too committed atrocities, I mean, she had Otto Roos keel hauled. I mean, you know, put on a rope and dragged underneath the hull of a ship, which could very well have killed him, the Avon River, and that initiated overboarding. So she was not sweetness and light, but she very frequently would stop um, her husband and say, you've got to let people sleep, or you have to do something. And Miscavige, there's nobody. He you know and I mean, very early on, I corresponded with Diane Didi Vogadine, who had been pretty much Hubbard's immediate deputy. She was the head of the Watchdog Committee, the Commodore's Messenger organization, and she wrote to me about Miscavige and said, well, he was not really, he had no significant position. He was the action chief. He was meant to sort out the 300 outstanding writs and subpoenas against Hubbard so Hubbard could come back into public life, and which, of course, he signally failed to do. Um, but he had no other job. But she made this one comment about him, which has always stayed with me. And it's about 1984 that she wrote to me, that if you asked him to do something, so you'd say to him, David, there's a wall there, and I want you to get rid of it. He would put his head down and charge. And it's said that when he was a cameraman, age 17, on Hubbard's bizarre technical films, all of which have been withdrawn, we note, because they're so bloody awful. That when he was a cameraman, he was the only person who was willing to say no to Hubbard.
Mm.
That he'd stand up to him, and so Hubbard. I've never heard this before, but in this book, Mike says that he called him Misk, as in Mr.
Yeah, that was an
Flame.
interesting new detail,
Yeah,
right?
and so there's some sort of relationship there. It would be great to see more of how Miscavige actually gained power, and I think you and I both know a lot more about that than Mike directly experienced. But
Well, there's an interesting. I thought one great detail that was new for me was that after the FBI raid, Scientology was raided by the FBI in 1977, and 11 Scientologists ended up going to prison, including Mary Sue, L. Ron Hubbard's wife. And he allowed, Ron Hubbard allowed his wife to take the fall for him, basically.
yeah, she
And
made a deal and signed a stipulation of evidence of more than 200 pages admitting everything on the grounds that he would not be prosecuted.
so the Guardian's office, the spy wing that was
Hmm?
associated with Mary Sue, then had to be gotten rid of. And Mike describes how he was flown out to St. Hill. I didn't know about this. This
Hmm?
was new to me. That he was one of four messengers who were sent to St. Hill in the UK by David Miscavige to oversee the Guardian's office as it was about to be dismantled
Yeah.
and replaced by the CMO and David Miscavige's crew. And there's this great line Mike has. He says, "In Scientology, history is written by those who have the ear of Hubbard,
Hmm.
and that no longer described Mary Sue. It was now Miscavige."
Yeah.
So that was very interesting. That and then Um, yeah, basically Miscavige, and with Hubbard's approval, Miscavige then sort of banished Mary Sue to a very nice prison, which was this house in Los Feliz, California. Very nice house she lived her years out in.
Mm.
But it was very clear that she no longer had any power in Scientology.
And we have from elsewhere the story of Miscavige throwing a heavy glass ashtray at her during their confrontation, and also that um, she kept, when she came out, well, she was in prison. She was in prison for a year, I think. When she came out, she kept writing to her husband. Having made this incredible sacrifice, she was really not a well woman. Scientology had not given her perfect glowing health. She suffered from hypoglycemia. And she kept writing letters, and the instruction from Hubbard was that he didn't want anything negative, what Scientologists call N theta or enturbulated theta, nothing negative. So I was told by somebody who was involved with this, they'd photocopy the letters and they'd take a razor blade and cut out anything negative. And he said most of the letters to Hubbard, and he didn't reply to any of them, um, read, "Dear Ron, love Mary Sue." Oh dear. And I mean, he says, I think one of the very touching things was him, of course, he opens the book, as you say in your excellent review, with a letter to his adult children, both in their 40s, who he's barely spent any time with because, he was busy saving the world, and they went through the cadet organization as children. So they have worked for Scientology all of their lives. But along the way, we find out that he was forced to marry his wife Kathy because there'd been a night of fun in the Sea Org where people had got drunk and things had got a little out of hand, and they were then told, right, well, if you slept with somebody, you now have to marry them. So it's not quite as bad as Sun Myung Moon. At least he had met her before, but um, then she falls pregnant, and the baby dies from sudden infant death syndrome. And he talks about having 45 minutes of Scientology auditing to get over the grief. And
Yeah,
this, he talks later about not being able to go to his father's funeral. And this is something that I've found is so common, with the hundreds of Scientologists I've spoken to over the years, that they'll have lost a parent or a partner or a child, somebody they loved, and they'll have been told, well, they've just dropped the body, and they will sort of somehow manage to repress the emotion that they should be feeling, and then 20 years later, or however long, it suddenly hits them, like a hurricane, and
right.
they will then grieve, and grieving is a very normal process. To have that closed down, because you've got to be on purpose, you've got to be, following and upholding command intention at all times. So you're being turned, your humanity is being taken away from you at every step. When we were at Toronto, Hannah Whitfield was talking, and she used the word terminal, referring to a, another person, a terminal,
Right.
this Scientology term. And she realized the moment she'd said it, this kind of dehumanizing way of um, relating to other people, that is absolutely at the core of Scientology.
Oh yeah. No, there's a lot. Yeah, and I mentioned that that was such a fascinating way to frame the book because then no matter where the story's going, there's not going to be a happy ending. I mean, he's got this wonderful second family. His boys are great, and but it's just this constant source of hurt for him
Mm,
that his daughter is on this bizarre campaign. And I feel for her. I mean, I hope someday in her life, we're talking about Taryn, his oldest daughter, that she will at some point have this moment of clarity and realize how she's simply been used as a tool by David Miscavige in this very cruel game that he's playing.
mm,
Um, and it's heartbreaking to see, but it's also so ineffective. I know you've seen this in other campaigns. They do it against me too. Is they find something that they think is going to hurt their enemy, and then they just keep pushing that button, even though outsiders know, well, it's Scientology. They're lying.
mm.
It doesn't work.
No,
Um, but it's
If Scientology says it isn't true, I mean, the dead agent pack, as they call it when they attack somebody to make them a dead agent by ruining their reputation. Um, the one on me, people, some of the things in it are true. you know, I have. I was only 19 when I got involved in Scientology. I hadn't had much time to be a bad person. But yeah, I'd been busted for having a tiny amount of cannabis resin when I was 17. And again for having a single 3-inch high cannabis plant when I was 19. So, they'll put that stuff out. But what tends to happen is that people will see this stuff and they won't believe any of it because of the source it comes from. So the other things they've said about me being a heroin addict, attempting murder, a rapist, a child molester, they have no basis in fact. Oh dear. I mean, and he says there's a point where he says, I was convinced Hubbard understood things about me that I did not know about myself. I had to look into my heart and, with Scientology auditing, counseling, uncover the evil that lurked within and eradicate it. The reason I am not doing well and am so unhappy is that I have unhandled false and evil purposes. So and it's a tactic that's used by many groups, this idea you have an invisible enemy inside you that you don't know about, but Ron Hubbard or whoever knows about it, and they're going to disclose this. And it's a nonsense. We have unconscious processes, but there is no unconscious mind plotting against us, and there are no, well, in my case anyway, there are no demons inside us, you know clouding our thought. We're responsible for what we do. And we to, that sort of thing, that you are always in a child to parent relationship, almost an infant to parent relationship, a preteen thing. And it's something I often observe, particularly with people who were long term Sea Organization members. When they left, they were about 12 years old. No matter how old they were, their ability to deal with the world was like a 12-year-old. And they would then often go through in a kind of accelerated teen period, where they'd grow their hair long and smoke dope or, do whatever they did in adolescence and then come out of it and join the world. But keeping people in that state of dependence upon you, where you can't actually become an adult, you can't actually fully develop yourself, you have to comply absolutely with the wishes of a maniac, a man who had absolutely no concern about other people. I got into a little bit of a thing with Chris Shelton. It was about a year ago, and we were talking, and he talked about. He said, "Well, what about Hubbard's compassion?" And I said, "I'm not aware of any example of Hubbard's compassion." And he told me this story. He said, "Well, there was this woman, and he'd shouted at her, and then he walked up to her, and he said, 'Are you still mad at me?'" And Chris was, "Yeah." It's like, yeah, I've heard that story from so many people. He had a stock phrase that when he had reamed somebody out and left them in a puddle on the floor, he'd leave them for a couple of hours, realize that they weren't working properly anymore, and go up and say, "Are you still mad at me?" and put his arm around them. It, he really, I think, was a solipsist. He just thought we were creatures of his imagination. He didn't care anything for us.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned that Mary Sue then played this sort of uh, role where it was her job to kind of keep him from going too far,
Mm,
from trying to smooth things over with people that maybe he'd chewed out or whatever.
mm,
Because the people I interview about Shelley describe her that way.
yeah.
That yes, Shelley could be a hard ass,
Mm,
hard nosed executive in her own right, but what they remembered is when, Dave came through like a hurricane and just, caused so much havoc and hurt people, and physically beat them up.
yeah.
Shelly was then there to like, are you okay? Can I get you
Mm,
something?
exactly.
And that was her role. But what's interesting then, and then they both got rid of them, right? I
Yeah.
mean, um, Hubbard ended up in hiding and never saw his wife again.
Mm,
With Miscavige, it's the other way around. He's put her in hiding,
mm,
and he's doesn't have her around anymore. And the other thing I've been asking people, I don't remember who it was, said something to. Oh, I think it was Mark Headley
mm,
pointed out to me that Yeager Mithoff, Will here. These guys would go bowling with Dave on the weekends. And I thought, well, wait a minute. You know, how is it that, he creates the hole and put all these guys in prison and they're basically the only friends he's ever had.
Mm,
So what does that leave him with? I just I think you're right in some ways. He's like Hubbard, but cranked up to 11
mm.
as far as the ruthlessness and the
Hubbard on steroids,
yeah,
probably
yeah,
literally at some point. Yeah, given his asthma when he was young.
right.
I'm sure you feel the same way. But when I interviewed his dad, Ron Miscavige, it was really hard to think that a man who was so sweet natured had sired such a malevolent um, child. Um, and Ron was still trying to justify it. I mean, I remember him saying in the interview that um, David was fine until 1993. He goes, not really, Ron.
No,
He
no,
did play the
no.
trumpet for me, so that was good. I mean, and some of the horror. I mean, one of the things that I think really has to be understood, it is the extreme punishments that were being issued. And so I've interviewed a few people, I'm sure you have, who were sentenced to clean Rats Alley in the big blue buildings. And Mike has this typical of Sea Org renovation projects everywhere, and especially those employing RPF labour. There were no proper tools and equipment to do the job. We did demolition work with absolutely no protective glasses, gloves, or helmets. We used rollers to paint thousands of square feet of walls when it could have been done in a fraction of the time with a sprayer. We cracked cement blocks with sledgehammers rather than jackhammers. It was intended to be hard manual labour, and power tools would have defeated that objective. Nobody was actually trained in the skills necessary to do any of the tasks we were assigned. I mean, I saw this. I headed the renovation of the Deansgate Bank building in Manchester because I knew a little bit about, home improvements. And the people they assigned to me, they just had no clue of how to do even the simplest, decorating tools, decorating tasks. I remember one guy coming to me with a grin on his face, having stabbed a door with his paintbrush to the point where it had, splayed out. Um, it was learn as you go. According to Hubbard, Sea Org members are supposed to be able to do any job assigned, whether they've been trained or not. If you need a nuclear power station building and you've got some damp string, a Sea Org member can do it. The solution was never to get better equipment, give more realistic targets, or add more manpower. The answer was invariably work longer. During these renovation stints, we went days on end with no sleep at all. When we were told we could sleep for an hour or 90 minutes, we would lie down on the bare concrete floor right there. I was assigned to clean Rats Alley. This was the crawl space between the main galley where the grease and slime ended up as the ovens and meal prep stations were cleaned up. It was a space about 2 feet high, inhabited by numerous rats, quite large rats according to the people I've interviewed, who lived on the food waste that accumulated there. To clean Rats Alley, I had to lie on a furniture dolly on my stomach and wheel myself around with a flashlight to scrape grease. I mean, another punishment there was uh, cleaning out the crematorium. So, and there were still human remains in there. And just this, how could people treat other people this way? How could they become used to this? And you come back to this, well, we're saving the world.
All right.
I remember talking with a guy who he bragged to me that he'd actually taken a day off course so that he could go and get the Foster report, the British government report, the day it was published. So he was, you know, and this is a dozen years later, he's bragging that he did that. And when I said to him, I think that Scientology is a fascistic organization. It certainly isn't democratic. And he said it has to be because of what we don't have time, to play around. And that bizarre attitude that we have to break all the rules of morality so that we can become moral, which we hear altogether too often. Um,
Yeah, I mean, it's I've tried to explain to people that, the question I always get, or I don't know if it's the question I always get, or the question I always being seeing posed is why why can't Tom Cruise see that he is, aligned with this crazy group and that
Mm.
these ideas are insane? And I always come back with he can't understand why you haven't joined.
Yeah,
I mean, it's
what's
such
wrong
a
with you?
powerful idea. Once you adopt the idea that L. Ron Hubbard really did discover the secrets of the universe and that this only Scientology really understands what's going on, that this is a prison planet like the Matrix, and the rest of us are just sleepwalking through what life, and only Scientology knows what's going on. Once
Mm,
you buy into that idea, it's incredibly powerful
mm,
because then, like you say, everything else is seen through that filter. So, oh, we're treating people badly, yeah, but on the larger scale, this is what we have to do to get to this higher state that L. Ron Hubbard promised.
yeah, and you start getting, I've tried to understand the mindset. You know, I left within a few weeks. I found myself in the bizarre position that I was at the very center of the independent Scientology movement in Britain, and I didn't believe anymore. And it was, but I had such a loyalty for others who'd been through the experience, and of course my experience, my 9 years was really like a luxury cruise. I was I was never humiliated or abused. I was shouted at twice. I shouted back. I didn't know I wasn't meant to. So I wasn't in the sea organization. I wasn't on staff. I'd had a relatively easy time of it. But I I think it was the unfairness, that child sense of how unfair it was that we'd been so consistently lied to, and realizing, that Hubbard was a confidence trickster. There were, it's impossible to think otherwise because he contradicts himself all over the place. He tells, as the guy who started in on his biography and worked with Russell Miller on it, we found so often that he'd completely contradicted some previous story about himself. And I come back to this frequently. This man said honesty is sanity. He said the road to truth must be trod with true steps. He was a liar, not based upon what anybody else says, but based upon the comparison of his own statements. And so you have this thing. Why didn't we see that? Why didn't we understand that? When I came back, I read Dianetics, Modern Science and Mental Health 3 times when I was in Scientology. When I came back to critique it, I couldn't believe that there are so many contradictions in it. Dianetics was developed without the use of hypnosis. Dianetics was developed with the use of hypnosis. They're on different pages, but it's in the same book. So you've got this, as you know, in the pieces I wrote for the bunker, that I started to go, well, this is a double bind. This is, which Hubbard also talked about. If you give people contradictory information, they won't know what to do. They'll become confused and they'll come and ask you what to do. And I became interested in the whole psychology of it, the whole mindset of it, and what are the traps and how is it that people that we don't see it. Um, I was in touch with a wonderful professor of psychology, Kapta Akhmedova. She did a 2 year study on the Black Widows, suicide bombers in Chechnya. And I contacted her because she'd done this great thing where she'd managed to get 100 people, largely children, out of hospital who were exhibiting profound symptoms of what is called mass sociogenic illness. I mean, they were projectile vomiting and all sorts of things. And it took her 2 years to do this. And I put this story in the book I was writing, Opening Our Minds, and I didn't have enough details. And my editor, Johnny Jacobson, the wonderful Johnny Jacobson, said, get in touch with her. And she was an alumni of an American university, although she was Chechnyan. And within 24 hours, I had this email back from her saying how much she'd liked my book. And I'm sort of going, what are you doing reading a book about Scientology? And she then went, it's really helpful to give to terrorists, to people who've been radicalized. It's like, what is she talking about? And I didn't understand it until we re-released the book and I asked her for a puff piece. And it's basically the thought that I am a reasonably intelligent person, and you know, and I was fooled by this, so therefore, and I think it is that question which um, anybody has to ask, having been involved in such a system, why did I fall for it? And usually it's because of idealism. It's because we do live in a corrupt world. And, especially when you're a teenager, I was 19 when I got involved, you want to belong to a group that's going to do something about it.
Right.
And if you join Greenpeace and you start wondering about why the material on genetic modification is, their own head of science actually left over them, you kind of, or if you're in the Catholic Church and you hear about child abuse, you don't want the organization to have a bad reputation. There's always that um, my side bias, confirmation bias of the cognitive dissonance of, I can't believe that my organization overall is good, and we all suffer from it. It's just that it becomes fervent in groups that are fervent, like Scientology. So, again, we come back to Mike, trapped in this thought that there must be something wrong with him, you know, rather than it's a
Right.
from beginning to end. It does not work. It doesn't achieve any of the things it claims.
Well, you brought up independent Scientology, and I wanted to touch on that just
Mm.
briefly because um, there are still people who apparently are under the impression that Mike is still some kind of Scientologist, and that just means that they haven't paid attention
No, they haven't.
to his blog, or to
No.
his show with Leah. But Mike, like so many people, did go through that progression where a lot of Scientologists come out because they finally can't take David Miscavige's
Mm.
deprivations any longer. They can't take the extreme fundraising or whatever, and they come out, but they sort of wistfully wish they could get back to a kind of L. Ron Hubbard centered
Mm.
Scientology that's grown up in their mind as some sort of ideal, and so they become independent Scientologists, and they practice Scientology outside of the church. When I went down to Florida for the first time to meet Mike Rinder 10 years ago and sat down with him and we talked about a lot of these things, he was definitely still an
Oh yeah.
independent Scientologist at that time. He didn't hesitate. When I asked him what his OT level was, he told me and everything.
Mm.
And he left out a really fun little detail from the book, but I don't know if he told you. One of the things he did get very involved with some of these other, Marty Rathbun and Robert
Yeah, yeah.
Almblad, that they were actually thinking about, creating their own independent church of Scientology,
Mm.
mainly as a way because they knew it would drive David Miscavige crazy, right? I mean, that was always the main goal. It wasn't. I don't think they were really all that interested, but they. I don't know if you've heard this one, John, and I'm sorry he left it out of the book, but Robert Almblad is this inventor that was trying to invent clean ice that got harassed so badly because he dared to give Mike Rinder a job
Mm.
when Mike left Scientology. Uh, they knew they were being watched and surveilled and spied on. So and Robert Almblad, and I don't know if Marty was involved, somebody else, they purposely floated the rumor that they were going to buy a building in Clearwater right under David Miscavige's nose and make it the first physical independent Church of Scientology
Mm.
right inside the Flag land base. And they just floated that rumor. And sure enough, not too much longer, Church of Scientology paid like twice what that building was worth just to make sure that they didn't get their hands on it.
Yeah. I
It was a
mean,
wonderful stunt.
yeah, I mean, it's incredible that probably Scientology, the International Association of Scientologists, is down to about 20,000 members now. Um, I'm not sure that the whole thing was ever over 50,000, but um, we have a situation where there are probably more independents, uh, people in the Runzorg or the Free Zone, the terms that Captain Bill Robertson invented for them. There are probably more independents than there are fee-paying, card-carrying members, largely because of the Russian and German contingents. And I know that you you get into this to some. I try and keep away from this stuff, Danny. Um, but sometimes they'll make these pronouncements about the new technology they've developed. Of course, the late, not great but remarkable Captain Bill, who I knew pretty well, um, he developed a whole extension of the OT levels, where you did each OT level according to the 7 divisions of the organizing board. So you now had 56 OT levels to do.
Oh,
And
jeez.
this is I mean, that's a whole other story, isn't it? Captain Bill is just a
Right.
remarkable story. But a 6'4" former Mississippi motorcycle cop who used to dress up in a ball gown at 8 o'clock every evening and sing love songs to Ron Hubbard in the mirror was the founder of Ron's Org and the founder of the Free Zone. And I don't think it's got a lot better since. Um, I mean, there's something. I mean, I think that Mike definitely has plenty of material for a follow up. That um, when I talked with him about the harassment that was visited on me, he didn't really remember it. I think it was just such a fog of sleep deprivation and being bawled at by David Miscavige that he genuinely doesn't remember the minutiae of the projects. But it would be good to see. I think there's definitely a whole book in what was done to Jerry Armstrong, to Dennis Ehrlich, the Swedish campaign, and he tantalizingly mentions one name, and I wonder if you know anything about this. He mentions Laura Terrapin.
Yes, that was very interesting. The people of the LMT, this was after Lisa McPherson died in 1995. Uh, a New England businessman named Bob Minton
Mm, bless him.
was wanted to lead sort of a protest movement, so he created an actual business called the Lisa McPherson Trust, which bought a building in Clearwater, and they were very involved in protests. And Scientology sent in a mole,
Mm,
and I think they knew fairly early on that that was not her real name and that she was a spy. I don't think that's new in this book.
no.
I mean, it seemed familiar to me, so I don't know. I mean, it's a great detail, and I'm glad he included it.
Mm,
But I don't think that was known before this.
yeah, and I mean, the Lisa McPherson Trust. It's sad that it was not successful in getting justice for the killing of Lisa McPherson. But Laura Terrapin, and it's, as far as I know, it's an assumed identity. It, you know, there is apparently somebody who is called Terrapin out there, and she stole this identity. And he doesn't tell us anything. He just says she had previously infiltrated the cult awareness network. Now, there were 54 cases brought by Kendrick Moxon, the head of Scientology's litigation unit, and an unindicted co conspirator in the Guardian's office case. 54 lawsuits were brought against the Cult Awareness Network. I think Dan Leopold ended up trying to resist those. I had a little bit to do with it. I was over in LA and provided, I think, a few documents. But the first 53 cases were won, and the last one was lost. And so much of it was down to this woman, Laura Terrapin. And the tragedy is that nothing has risen from those ashes. That when the Cult Awareness Network went, nothing came forward to replace it. You have
Yeah,
the International Cultic Studies Association, but there's a more academic sort of thing. And the Cult Awareness Network was very effective. They just wandered over into that territory where they were willing to recommend kidnap deprogramming.
yeah.
And
Well, Mike does mention a couple other spy names that I think we had heard before. I guess regarding some of these OSA details, I've been targeted myself over the years, and there have been some pretty elaborate operations run against me and my family. And as a target, I can tell you that I've basically done my best just to ignore it or, not let it bother me. But one thing that does, it is the not knowing that
yes,
will nag at you. It's like, how did they know to call that person? How did they figure this out about my life? And that I'm sure, you know, there's Jerry Armstrong was harassed for years and years. I mean, he's still in Canada because he can't come back to the US.
Yeah.
Um, I would like to have seen a little bit more detail. I think there's a lot. There's so, Mike covers so much in this book.
Mm.
It's astounding how
Yes.
much material he gets through in this book.
Yes.
But when he and Christy were going through the harassment, and there was this woman Heather McAdoo in their neighborhood that was spying on them, and there was the camera in the bird house and stuff. I just thought that's so interesting to read. I wish there was just a little bit more of that
Mm.
from back when these other people were being harassed under Mike Rinder. I would have liked a few more details, but I think the amount of material he does cover is just amazing. I remember I was about 5 or 6 chapters in, and I thought, dude, you're only in the 70s. You got to get all the way up to 2017 in the aftermath.
Yeah.
How are you going to do this?
Mm.
So I was just super impressed at how much he put in, and so I hate to criticize for that there's not this detail or that detail, because the amount of detail he got in, it's a great book, and I just highly recommend it to anybody.
I agree, and I think it's beyond criticism. You've got a few hundred pages to do what you're going to do, and I mean, when I published Let's Sell These People a Piece of Blue Sky, the original in 1990, I was aware that it represented less than 5% of the material I'd gathered, and you have to choose which stories you're going to tell. Um, and I think he does tell. The focus of this for me is his story, and there are some of the things he did, so I wouldn't in any way criticize him for not going into detail. I just urge him to write another book immediately, so that we
Yeah.
can find out that. There are some interesting things about David Miscavige, the current Führer, as I like to think of it, as Scientology. He says, for example, David Miscavige once described me to the assembled members of the Watchdog Committee, the highest ranking people in Scientology, as the spawn of a retarded sloth's DNA. That was quite poetic. I've never heard. Um, and
For a high school dropout.
yeah, for a high school dropout. And then he says once he'd started, shoving them in the hole, he appeared in CMO International with a pile of white paper plates adorned with magic marker. Each one had a smiley face drawn on it, but without the smile. The mouth was a straight line. He called them pie faces. These paper plate masks were handed out to everyone, and we were all required to hold them in front of our faces while he addressed us. I would rather look at those pie faces than your actual pie faces. We had to keep the pie face masks in place during any interaction with him. This is this is madness. This is just and
It's
then
a wonderful image too, and that was new to me. I that was
oh,
amazing.
I hadn't heard of the pie faces. And then he talks about being at St Hill in Sussex in England. He ordered his then right hand man, Greg Wilhere, to take Heber, the president of the Church of Scientology, Mark Yeager, Guillaume Lesevre, and me, and throw us in the lake at the bottom of the St Hill property. It was a chilly, overcast November afternoon. And this is England. That means cold. Will here allowed us to take off our shoes and strip down to pants and shirts before we waded into the freezing cold, almost black water. The bottom was stagnant, slimy mud. Our assignment was to remain in the lake, clearing away weeds and debris for a few days until
Ugh.
Miscavige decided he wanted to return to California. Um, and none of us uttered a word of protest or disagreement. That would have made our circumstances even worse. Um, this is going on, and it's going on under the name of religion, and with the sort of protection that the law affords in various places in the world. It I'm incredulous that this kind of practice can go on, um, and is not sanctioned in some way legally. Um, but that
Well,
is
and to put a point on that, I mean, Mike escaped in 2007. He went public in 2009 with the Tampa Bay Times and BBC and Brian
phenomenal.
Seymour in Australia. He was one of the main characters in Going Clear
Yep.
in 2015. He and Leah Remini had this prominent series on cable television from 2016 to 2019. Um, and he has never been sued, never even a threat of. I mean, I'm sure they've threatened A&E, but they never, nothing like that. And yet, after all these years of saying all of these things and writing about them in his blog and putting them in, movies and TV, CBS canceled his appearance on Wednesday because Scientology's attorneys got noisy with them. So it's just amazing that as much as um, you and I can see, I don't know, it's just amazing to me that even now that these networks can be shuttered into silence by Scientology's antics.
Yeah, I mean, I was asked on to um, Donahue, Solly Jesse Raphael, twice in each occasion, Larry King, and every time they cancelled um, because material was fed to them. In fact, on Larry King, I was meant to be flying over to New York. This is before he started working with the Russians, of course. I was meant to be flying over to New York, and they were going to put Earl Cooley, who was a very well-known trial attorney, um, up against me. And Cooley had done the third OT level, and at the last minute, I'm all getting ready to pack my bag. I'm called and told, no, you won't be going on. I've so many times been filmed for pieces, and they manage through their lawyers to, convince the network to withdraw. I think there was a real turning point with because of the time, because of Rich Behar's article in Time, that they expended so much effort. I mean, I've been told they spent about $20 million on that case, and that Time spent about 2 million in response to it. But it dragged on for 20 years, and Miscavige seemed to make a sea change at that point and say, because we got, I think when they, with the IRS, when they won against the IRS in '93, they dropped 3,000 suits in a single day. This is undoubtedly the most litigious organization that has ever existed on the face of Earth. They issued tens of thousands of suits. And suddenly Miscavige went, the money is draining out um, like a serious wound. Um, it's not, it's giving us terrible press. And so he went against the Hubbard idea that you wipe out anybody who comes against you, by using the law to harass, to use L. Ron Hubbard's famous phrase. And that paved the way for Janet Reitman's Inside Scientology, which, as you know, I'm a little bit sore about because it's a rewrite of my own work, but never mind. Or much of it is. The first 7 chapters she credits to me and to Russell Miller um, in her reference notes. But it there'd been 20 years without a book being issued, with so little publicity, and the floodgates opened. And thankfully you were there to actually provide accurate information and make sure that everything was done in a proper fashion, and which has been remarkable. And I think everybody should pause now and give you 5 minutes of applause in a standing ovation.
Oh, come on.
Well, one of the things that got me was reading about the hole, and again, you've helped to make that very public. And he says there were at least 140 hole dwellers at its
Yeah,
peak. So they've
right.
packed in the senior executives of Scientology into these incredibly unsavory conditions. And it reminded me, and I am often reminded of this, of the Chinese thought reform camps. The way that he talks about the murder routine, where you accuse somebody of something far more serious than the things they've done to get them to confess to lesser things. Well, that's done in the Chinese camps. The written confessions are very important there. But there's also this essential method which is called the hot seat in many authoritarian groups, which was developed in those Chinese camps in the 1940s, where you have a room full of people screaming abuse at you. And he says,
Yeah.
new arrivals were like chickens thrown into an alligator infested pond with people fighting to be the one to confront the newcomer. So you've got these soul destroying approaches. Um, you know, he talks about,
Yeah, and we've heard descriptions of the hole over the years. Numerous people have been in it that came out, and we've known about being fed slop and only getting a shower once. Being able to leave one time a day to get a shower. But you're right. That's what he adds in this book in such a depth that I don't think we've had before, is the mental side of it and these games they were playing on each other, and just every single day, this horrible, confess, confess, confess. I don't how and that they've been in there for years, John. I don't understand how they could keep that up every day.
no. And again, with the Chinese camps, people could be in there for anywhere up to 8 years. Um, and what's been a bit lost in the sort of cult counter cult apologist arguments, um, is the idea that brainwashing, see now the Chinese term for it, is a purely psychological process. And it isn't. And very much as he says, slapping, punching, and kicking were the typical punishments for recalcitrance, meted out by the hole's denizens to one another. And so you set people on each other physically, not just psychologically. Um, he talks about, I think, his last encounter with Marty Rathbun, who's put into the hole before Marty leaves. And I don't really have anything good to say about Marty Rathbun, so I'm not. And he says, Marty sat on my chest with his hands around my throat as the mob chanted, come clean, Rinder. And his own wife, Kathy, has been put in there. And she, as he says, got in on the act, accusing him of having had sex with Vicky Asnaran. So, how on earth do you maintain your equanimity in an environment like that? How do you not break? I think,
But then there's that amazing moment. This was one of my favorite things in the whole book. Was and sorry for spoilers, people listening if you haven't
yeah,
read the
this is
book
an
yet.
alert. Put your phones in
Um,
your ears.
they're in that moment, and Marty's on his chest, and he's people are chanting, and
Mm,
under at a low level, so nobody around them can hear it. Mike says to Marty, I'm tired of this game,"
mm,
and Marty says to him, "I am too."
yeah. And climbs off
And
and leaves.
there's that little admission to each other that they know this is all just an act, a game. It's and they've had it.
Mm.
And then very soon after that, they were both out. So, Marty left 3 years before Mike did, but they were both on their way out after that. That's for sure. Let me just I want to provide a couple of not corrections, but details. You had mentioned the size of the IAS,
Mm.
and that it's probably only about 20,000. That's the number of the International Association of Scientologists. That's the membership organization of Scientology.
And you can't
Uh,
take the courses unless you're a member. You get a 6 month free membership, but after that, you have to pay up.
but it's an indication of how big this thing is. And you mentioned that you didn't think it was ever bigger than 50. Jefferson Hawkins was on the podcast a few weeks ago, and he said at one point he actually got the document because he was doing the marketing,
Mm.
and he got a documentation and found that they had a master list. Okay. And you have to understand, this is anybody who had ever joined, not who was currently active.
Yeah.
But the IAS, the full IAS membership for all time was 100,000.
Wow.
And
And that
again, that's
going back
not who was
to its foundation in what, 1984, 85?
exactly. That's so Scientology's never had the millions that it said. The other number that I wanted to just interject was so Time Magazine came out with this story in 1991 by Rich
Yeah.
Bahar. Scientology sued for $400 million. As you say, Scientology probably spent 20 million pursuing that losing lawsuit, and Scientology but Time spent about two. Bahar told me it was more like 6 to 8 million
Mm.
that Time Magazine
Yeah.
spent defending itself. and ultimately won, but it created a chilling effect. Other
Yeah,
news organizations did not want to go near Scientology for at least another 10 years. There was very little coverage of it after that because of that lawsuit. So I just wanted to interject those two
yeah.
numbers.
I mean, I think Let's Sell These People a Piece of Blue Sky was the last book, so published in 1990. Was the last book in the English language until Janet Reitman's book in, I think, 2011. And so many times I worked on stories, and you must have done this too. I'd work on a story for 6 months or a year, and then suddenly it'd be dropped. Um, the famous, wonderful Sapel Welkos articles in June 91, was it?
Yeah.
In the LA Times. I worked with them over a 5 year period, and I did get a free baseball cap with the LA Times logo. So it wasn't all bad. Well, it was actually given to the other guy who was researching with me, but he didn't want it, so I got it. But I can't remember whether it was Bob Welkos or Joel Sapal who told me they dropped the story. The LA Times were just like, we don't want to do this. And they'd been working on it for 3 years. And then there was some kind of, fancy $1,000 a plate dinner. And the proprietors of the LA Times were there. And it was pointed out to them what the contents of OT3 were, operating Thetan level 3. And the suggestion was made that because there were Mormons among them and that this violated the secret material in some way of the Mormons, that pushed the story out again. It was okay. So whether that's true or not, I don't know. But demon infestation is found in just about every religion there is, one way or another, whether they call them body thetans or whatever, dibuks or gadons or whatever. But this thought that it only if somebody is personally affronted, if you upset one of the Murdoch family or something, then something will happen. Altogether, when I first submitted Blue Sky for publication, it went to 50 publishers. This was in 1986, and 11 of them came back saying, we'd really like to publish this book. And 10 of them said, but there wouldn't be any money in it. The other publisher was Collins, who at the time are now HarperCollins, but they were the biggest publisher in the world. And for 3 months, one of the editors there fought to have the book published. And in the end, they were just, but yeah, this is all good, but we're not going to make any money because they'll sue us. And so I remember the publisher of Cyril Vosper's book. He was just about to retire, and he wrote to me, and I can just see him in his, handmade Savile Row suit sitting there, and he signed off the letter, "Death to the evil cult." So people don't like them, but there is that fear, and when the likes of Richard Dawkins go out and say it's a major religion, it's like, in what sense? It's this tiny little group of fervent people who are well, Lisa McPherson, there was a journalist on, I think she was with the St. Pete Times, and we talked a couple of times. She was a woman in her 70s. She'd won a Pulitzer, not for a Scientology story. And she said that she was a friend of the DA. And so she said to him, why wasn't McPherson case pushed? And she said she'd found 8 other suspicious deaths at Clearwater. And she said that her friend, the DA, said, I don't want anybody counting the scotch bottles in my trash.
Yeah, yeah,
And
that's a good point.
it's and I guess you must occasionally reflect on this. You and your wife must occasionally reflect on, what the hell am I doing this for? And it's
Yeah.
certainly, when I came,
Every day.
yeah, when I came away from it, it's sort of, I have no skin in the game. I'm not upset with
Yeah.
anybody in Scientology. Let's go back to something you said earlier about the not knowing. That for me, one of the most incredible events in my career, in 1993, the head of Office of Special Affairs Investigation Unit, which is espionage harassment, came to me in the attempt, because everything had failed. She'd been running operations for 18 months and I was still going. So she came personally to talk to me. And at the end of 3 hours, and she told me, that she was a gopher, she was a lowly person, she was the head of OSA Invest. And I had somebody who'd recently come out, and they confirmed this for me, so that she came back the next day. And I confronted her with this guy and said, you're the head of this. What are you saying? And she broke down. And she spent 3 hours telling me what a horrific life she had had from the age of 6 in Scientology. It's the worst story I've heard of many terrible stories. Then she revealed that she had 4 people in my close circle who were reporting on me, and she got another one in training.
Wow.
And so you're finding out that people in this case, there was only one of them, but I'd taken him into my confidence, and he's going and writing reports. Um, there was a woman whose husband had multiple sclerosis. He was a record producer. He produced Jerry Rafferty, though not the famous Baker Street, things like that. And she'd been phoning me up, and one of her friends left, and it was somebody I'd known years before. And she called me up and said, "Look, all of the questions I asked you were given me by OSA, and I recorded all of our conversations." So that sense that you know anything you say may be used in evidence against you, even if you say it in private. I started. I thought it was very good for me because it meant, you know, I'll have to be a good person. I have to, be and not have the. I made sure that anybody who came to me who wanted to help me, that they didn't. It wasn't because they wanted to harm Scientologists. Sadly,
Yeah.
then that meant that over the years, there are only about 2 or 3 people were useful because most people are upset. And you know, so being in the situation where you find out that you know even people you thought were intimates. I mean, you wrote The Unbreakable Miss Lovely, which is a brilliant book, I think. And there you have the story of Paulette Cooper, and who I think probably suffered worse than anybody in terms of and finding out that somebody who'd befriended her and that she considered to be a friend was actually writing little notes saying, "I think she might kill herself," or "I got her up on the roof," or all of these
Right.
terrible things. It really does. The ground underneath your feet is no longer steady when you find those things out. Um, but
Yeah, I mean the methods are creepy, the methods are insidious. Um, but look, Janet Reitman's book wasn't sued. Lawrence Wright's book wasn't sued. HBO's Going Clear was HBO wasn't sued over Going Clear. A&E wasn't sued over um, the aftermath. The last suit against a media organization was the Washington Post in 1995.
mm,
So, we're coming up on 30 years on that. So I think it's just a shame that there are still news organizations that are shy because what you've been through, what I've been through, but especially people like Mike Rinder and Paulette Cooper and Jerry Armstrong, this is stuff people need to know because this organization is still doing this kind of thing today. They will keep doing it unless they are stopped. So I hope Mike's books does really well for Simon and Schuster, and they will. I think they'll be very happy that they took this book on.
mm.
And John, thank you very much for giving me your thoughts about it. Any final observation you wanted to make about the book?
Yeah, it is that he talks about the how you have to change your mind and what you have to do to leave. And he says at the moment that he's about to leave in 2007, what about my eternity and making it to the top of the Scientology bridge? What about my family? I still loved my children who are now 28 and 23, even though I never saw them. I loved my mother and siblings, whom I'd also lose if I left. So, bearing in mind that he not only stood up and spoke out, but he knew that he was going to lose contact with, you know, those who were intimate to him. There was a tremendously courageous thing to do. It's a very good book. It's well written. It's a page turner, and even for old hands like you and me, there is new material in there. So
Lots,
rush out
lots of
and
new
buy it.
stuff, lots of surprises. Pick it up, and I'm hoping maybe we'll find some follow up things to do in the bunker about it.
Yeah,
But
and of course, do definitely go and have a look at the interviews I did with Mike, where he talks about some of these events in detail. I'm always very happy to have more subscribers in my little channel.
And I'll definitely provide a link to that. Okay, John, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.